everyone, my name's Misbah. Welcome back to another video. I'm going to start today's video by talking about a book that I read this week. It's called Someone at a Distance and it's by an English novelist, Dorothy Whipple. It was published in 1953 and Dorothy Whipple's style is very precise and graceful, so it's a really easy book to read. It's a domestic story of a deceived wife and a very foolish husband. So we start with this married couple, Avery and his wife Ellen. They've been married for 20 years. They have 2 children. So their son is doing national service. Their daughter is at boarding school and comes home for the holidays. And Avery is successful in business. They're very well off. Ellen devotes her life to looking after her house and garden and caring for her family. Avery has an elderly mother, Mrs. North, who is incredibly lonely, and she feels that the family don't visit her enough and she feels neglected. Mrs. North hires a companion, and the companion is a young woman called Louise Lanier. And Louise comes from France, and the reason why she's come to England is because she had an unhappy affair, and the boy that she was in love with jilted her and married another woman who was wealthy. So Louise is very bitter, and she arrives in England and she devotes herself to Mrs. North and really takes care of the old lady, looking after her clothes and helping her choose her best jewels and really making the most of herself. Mrs. North becomes incredibly attached to Louise, and when Louise goes back to France, Mrs. North misses her and begs her to return. In the story then, Mrs. North dies and she leaves Louise an inheritance and her jewels and her furs. So Louise comes back to England to claim her inheritance. And while she's waiting for all the legal work to be done, she moves in to stay with Avery and his wife Ellen. So the 3 of them are now living in this house together, and she begins a slow seduction of Avery. She is envious of Ellen and she wants to break up the marriage because she feels that Ellen isn't making much effort with her husband and doesn't make much effort with herself, and she criticises Ellen. And it was very interesting to read about these two extremes of women. So Louise is young and attractive. She spends hours on her beauty regime. She has a very elaborate skincare regime. She dresses with this elegant chicness. She's very dainty, very feminine. She wears this exotic scent, and she really knows the art of flirting and of seduction. And Avery becomes very easily seduced by her. Ellen, however, dresses in old sweaters and muddy shoes and tramps around the garden, and she's far too busy with all the housework and caring for her family to actually sit down and spend quality time with her husband. So it's a real shock to her when she discovers this affair, and she's quite shattered by the discovery. And it was interesting to read how very quickly someone's life can be torn apart, and the fragment of their life, the threads can actually be unwoven so quickly. And Avery basically feels so incredibly foolish that he can't face his family, and he leaves with Louise. He thinks he has no choice but to go off with her because he's so embarrassed. He doesn't love Louise, but he can't face his family. And one thing leads to another, and they get divorced, and he ends up marrying Louise. At the end of the novel, Louise is even more unhappy than she was at the beginning. She thinks she will go back to France in this triumphant manner with a very rich husband, but when she returns, Her parents are appalled at what she's done. They are devout Catholics and don't believe in divorce, and they refuse to recognise her and Avery's marriage. So she's actually cut off from her family and her friends at the end of the book, and she detests Avery and hates her life. Avery goes into depression and turns to alcohol, and he seems to have this air of blaming everyone else for what's happened and thinking it's their fault. It's very interesting the way that it's written, because sometimes we are in Avery's head and we have his thoughts, and sometimes we're in Louise's head, and so we know what's going on in her mind. Ellen is genuinely good and has the happiest ending. She didn't see the affair coming, and she's quite shattered by it. Her family is totally destroyed and she loses her home. But her children and her friends rally round her, and in the end she has a different kind of life. She has a job working as a manager in an old folks home, and she has a new life. And so you see a glimmer of hope for her. I found it a very easy book to read and very interesting. It was like watching a film. It was you can actually see the events unfolding in front of you as you were reading. So I do recommend it, and I'm actually going to find other books by Dorothy Whipple and read those, because this is the first book and the only book that I've read by her, and I'm going to now look for other novels by Dorothy Whipple. So Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple. So thank you for watching this first part of my video, and I'll see you for the second part. So welcome to the second part of today's video, and I'm going to show you now my tomato plants that I've got in my greenhouse, and I'm going to go through 5 tips that work for me when growing tomato plants. So I've bought these tomato plants from the garden centre, and you can actually grow tomato plants in windowsills or in patios or in greenhouses, as I'm doing, and they just love the sun. They need 6 hours of sunlight a day. They really are sunny plants. So tip number 1 is when you actually buy the plant, so it'll be a small size, you have to put it in a plant pot that is large enough. It doesn't matter if the plant pot is plastic or terracotta, and I've seen fabric plant pots as well in the greenhouse, in the garden centres. So I'm just going to show you the size of pot that I'm using. So for a plant this size, I am using a plant pot of this size. Let me just carefully show you. So that is the size of plant pot I'm using. You can see the plant there in the middle. So you need to make sure, tip number 1 is use a plant pot that's actually large enough. I'll just put that down. So tip number 2, make sure you plant deep enough. So if you look here, I'll just show you on this one, there are tiny hairs. There are lots of tiny hairs there, and they are actually going to make the roots. So they're going to shoot outwards, and in the soil, they're going to make the roots. So you must make sure that you actually plant those hairs deep into the soil. So tip number 3, don't use garden soil. That will be too cloggy and it will not drain properly. And what I use, what I've bought this year, is I bought some Miracle Grow. Let me just pull it out. So I saw this on offer in the supermarket, and that's where I've got that from. So you can get a grow bag or just compost. So that is much better. So tip number 3, not garden soil, use some actual compost for growing. Tip number 4, they need to be watered consistently. So you can't just go away and forget about them for a few days and then suddenly remember that they need watering. You mustn't let the soil dry out. Otherwise the plant will become quite stressed, and when plants are stressed, then you're not going to get a very good crop. So watering and feeding consistently. Touch the soil, make sure that it is always moist. I never water the actual plant. I never water the leaves or the plant, because that will encourage mildew and fungus on the actual plant there. I always water the soil, very carefully watering the soil. I also give them feed, and I start to feed when I see the green, when I see the yellow flowers appearing. So that's when I start feeding my tomato plants. I use Tomarite, so 1 cupful in a gallon of water works for me, and I use that there. So the next tip is to actually provide them with support. So my final tip is make sure your tomato plants have support when they're growing. They are vine plants. They want to climb and grow around something. This year, I've decided to use string that comes from the top support here of my greenhouse and stretch the string and let the tomato plants grow up on the string. In the past, I've put canes or a structure into the plant pot and grown my tomato plants that way. So I'll come back in later weeks and I'll show you how I get on. So good luck if you are growing tomato plants as well this year. Thank you for watching the second part of my video. See you for the final part. Welcome back to the final part of today's video. So one of my favourite things to do in spring is to go for a walk through the woods when the bluebells are out. It's really magical to see a carpet of blue. And I don't think my camera can do it full justice, but I'll try. Also, the Rhodedendra and the azaleas are in bloom, so I'll take some images of those with you. And I hope you enjoy this final part of my video. Thank you for watching. See you next time.